She's a college student. He's like, what, a teaching assistant or...
I thought he was full-blown professor. Is he not?
If he is, I'm gonna leave you to defend that. Welcome to another video where I am playing catch up with videos that I should have posted a long time ago, like several months ago, because this one is specifically going to be about the rest of the books I read in 2024 that I didn't get to talk about in my channel. Because usually I post like a wrap-up video where I just talk about every book that I've read, and I stopped doing that like halfway through the year. And so this video is just going to be me playing catch up. But I have brought Victoria with me as an incentive to watch the video so that at least you see one hot person on camera.
Shut up.
But also because a couple of the books I read in like the second half of the year, like we have both read. So Victoria's going to be with me for like the first few minutes or first half of the video. And then I'm going to free you back to your cage so I can talk about the other books that I read. So yeah, it's just going to be a big giant book dump. I'm going to go over 39 books in total for this video. Yeah, it's going to be a lot. So when you talk about the books, try to make it quick.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I put together like a list of books that we had read together, and I figured that the first one that we can start with was Garlic and the Witch, because that was the first graphic novel we buddy read.
Okay, so it's these vegetables in a vegetable garden who get put under a spell by a witch, so they become kind of like, I don't want to say human, but they become like alive.
Basically, the main character is Garlic.
Yeah.
Like literally Garlic.
I love her.
She's like friends with this non-binary carrot.
Yeah, they're gay for sure.
They don't prescribe to one gender. If
Not
you
at
see
all.
the carrot, you know what I'm talking about.
Look at that carrot.
Like when you see a carrot, you're like, oh, you're a they them for sure.
Yeah.
You get oat milk.
Clocked it. Yeah,
For
you get
sure.
oat milk. Yeah, you
You-
get that lavender. You get that lavender oat milk latte, girl.
Garlic, the main character, has to go on an adventure with Vampire Daddy, and they have to go find like some ingredient for a witch. And she was so like afraid of everything because she was afraid to go out on her own. And at some point, she gets like stranded apart from like Daddy Vampire, and she's like, "Oh no!"
I'm not gonna lie, I did tear up in this book.
Yeah, I remember you had teared up reading it.
Yeah.
So overall, we both thought that this was very adorable.
It was really wonderful.
It's just about like trying to go outside of your comfort zone, and that's how you grow as a
Yeah.
person / Garlic.
I think they did a perfect balance of cutesy art and vibes, but also having like a strong theme.
The next one that we also read was the Tea Dragon Society.
Right.
It's basically about this lesbian / blacksmith apprentice, which is basically a lesbian, and she discovers a lost tea dragon in the marketplace, and then she meets like these tea shop owners that are like really chill.
There wasn't much of a plot.
It's honestly just vibes.
The art was really cute. It's almost kind of odd that there's not much of a plot because the evolution of the dragons is so rock solid. Like in the back of the book, it was telling us like all these different details of all the different dragons and like what they eat, how they came to be, what they can do, because each of them have like different abilities and stuff. And I'm like, this is pretty a lot in order for there not to be a whole lot of plot.
It's just cozy, it's sweet,
cute.
and the author's definitely, you know, making a franchise out of it, because there's like, what, cards? Or like
I
a
think
game
there's
that they made out of it?
Cards. I think there's a coloring book.
They got everything except a plot.
Yeah.
That's the story. And I say this with peace and love. That's fine. That's totally fine. I thought the dragons were cute. I enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed Garlic and the Witch.
I would keep reading it.
You know what was a wacky ass plot?
What?
My Gently Raised Beast. The premise, at least from what we saw just based on the cover, was this cute blonde girl, and then she has like a cute little black cat who turns out to actually be human, because the cover is super cute. Then you open to the first page, and then boom, she's like getting abused immediately.
Yeah.
And so the blonde girl's name is Blondina.
Of course.
She is an orphan who finds out that she is a long-lost princess. Then she gets snatched up to go into this palace.
It was good. Like, I would keep reading the story still, but it was definitely, like, jarring.
Personally, I think out of the graphic novels we read, I enjoyed the other two better because this one was giving me too much whiplash.
It was one of those books where I would give the second volume a chance.
And I would give it a second chance if you also happen to be there.
Yeah. Yeah.
So those were the graphic novels that we read together. But when I talk about books that we have started to read in 2025, we will be talking about Victoria finally discovering her shoujo manga era. You were kind of afraid to get into manga because They read from right to left.
I've had issues in the past.
I'll talk about this more in my 2025 book wrap-up video, but now that Victoria is discovering the world of shoujo manga, there is so much more to read ahead of us in the year. English licensed manga can only go so far. The real weeaboos know that the Japanese manga, the original source, is where you get ultimately unlimited options. And that's why I'm glad Migaku is sponsoring today's video. Migaku is a learning language platform that comes with a Chrome extension, an app, and so much more. This is such a cool way to learn a new language because now when I watch an anime on Crunchyroll or an Asian drama on Viki, I can use Migaku to translate the words and create flashcards with just one click and track my progress. I can even use the OCR feature to take a picture of a menu or manga and turn it into personalized lessons. And if I want to dive even further into learning Japanese, they have courses that cover everything from hiragana to katakana and essential vocabulary and advanced grammar concepts. So that's a great way to have more structured guidance, especially for a beginner like myself. So if you're interested in finally learning a new language, any Migaku subscription will give you access to all of these languages here. Migaku is also giving a 50% discount for their lifetime subscription along with an additional free month on standard and early access subscriptions. You can access these deals at migaku.com/witcindy. Now, let's get back to the wrap-up. Let's talk about traditional books that we've read, the sacred texts, starting with the originator of the sacred text herself, Ali Hazelwood.
Love her.
So the whole premise of Not in Love is that like the two main characters meet basically hooking up, right? It was going to be like a one-night stand kind of situation. They hook up and then they find out that career-wise, they are basically rivals. The main girl works as a biotech engineer at this startup. And then the main guy is part of another business that is seeking to acquire the startup. So that's why them being together is kind of like almost a conflict of interest because the main girl and like her colleagues are like, this guy's trying to snatch up all the hard work that we've created.
Yeah.
But little do they know that he only wants to snatch up that pussy. In classic Ali Hazelwood fashion, literally the moment that they meet to hook up, they haven't even had sex yet.
Yeah.
He is so down bad for her right away. I don't even care that there's no reason for him to like be so smitten and down bad for her.
Yeah, he was like immediately like in love, basically.
And she's like, oh, I gotta keep, my guard up because of various trauma that I've had living in poverty and having food scarcity,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, like she went through some shit. And then obviously she's trying to be like a girl boss and, she's trying to just keep hookups as hookups and career as career. And he's like, but I'm in love with her.
Allie can write an MMC. I just love a simp. I love a protective, large man. What can I say?
I thought it was kind of fun because she was emotionally distant this time. I like it when the guy's vulnerable instead. Yeah. That's how it should be. Another book that we can talk about. I picked up this book because you were so obsessed with it, and that's Gothikana.
Oh, Jesus Christ. It had me by the throat, okay? It was my break into dark academia. I related to the main character in a lot of ways. It just really resonated with my spirit.
So basically, the book is about this girl who receives this admission letter from this mysterious university. And she's like, I guess I'll take it because I got nothing else going on in life. The university is in this old secluded castle on top of a mountain. I remember at some point, she had to like mail a letter to the post office, and it was a whole journey to get to the post office.
It's a whole journey.
And they're only open during certain hours, and like the letter's gonna be to the recipient in like 2 weeks. Also, isn't there
who went with her on her journey?
Oh, you want to talk?
Who fucked in the cart?
Yeah, I remember that in front of USPS. The postman does not get paid enough for this shit.
And the guy is technically her professor.
She's a college student. He's like, what, a teaching assistant or...
I thought he was full-blown professor. Is he not?
If he is, I'm going to leave you to defend that.
You know what? What I do in the quiet of my own home is nobody's business.
That's true. That's why it's fiction, right? So that you can enjoy it. See, for me personally, the main reason why I couldn't get into it is because I just have no interest in like any student-teacher relationship. He would get so intense, okay? And he's saying stuff like, I'm your madness. And I'm like, sir, this is an English class.
Meanwhile,
what
I'm
you talking
eating
about?
That shit up. I was eating it up with a spoon.
You were. When there's scenes where like they were in a classroom and he's teaching shit, but he's giving her like intense eye contact the whole time. Like, the way I would be the other student in the classroom being like, hello? Is this allowed? People were disappearing like every 5 years in that school over the past century. But I think what's more fucked up is that they can't even have service. So I can't even have Wi-Fi when I'm there.
The true crime.
What is the point? And then the last book that we have both read is My Vampire Plus One. There was a previous book by the author called My Roommate is a Vampire. My Vampire Plus One is like it can still be read as a standalone. Mm-hmm. The main guy in this one was like a side character in the first book, and now you see him as a love interest. Personally, I like the first book better.
So I loved it. And my only gripe with the first book was that, okay, listen.
Listen, right, I remember this.
Here. You cannot, and I repeat, cannot have a vampire romance book and have no biting. That is sacrilege. You cannot do that. And that's what the first book was. Even though that book was fantastic. It was so fun. The couple was so cute. I really loved it. I did dock a star for no biting. I rated it 4 instead of 5 because what are you doing?
You gotta have the bite.
What are you doing?
Not even a nibble?
It was crazy. No, I think there was a nibble. He like nibbled on her finger or something.
Lame.
And I was like, what the fuck? Go for the neck or don't go at all. This is crazy.
Go for the jugular.
Anyways, what I'm saying is book 2, there is biting. So don't worry. Really? I'm looking out for you.
I'm really glad that she listened to you and she fixed that.
I'm really... Me, her close personal friend.
Yeah. Anyway, so this specific couple, the main girl was kind of like a girl boss. And basically, she needed to find a date because she was invited to a family wedding. And so that is how the main guy gets pulled in. What she doesn't know is that he is a vampire. And so...
I love a fake dating trope.
They had this conversation where he told her he was a vampire, and so she understood that about him, but she thought something else. So all this time he's like, oh, she knows the truth about me, and she's just thinking, this guy's a fucking weirdo, but whatever.
He's hot, so I guess I'll let it slide.
So that is pretty much the books that we read together for the year 2024. And I guess I will film the rest of my video just with books that I've read on my own. I don't know if you want to stick around for that. It's a lot of books.
That's okay.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. You just don't want to leave the couch, huh?
Pretty much.
The next books that I'm going to talk about are books that I already own, just so that you can still see visually something nice on camera and not just me on the couch the whole time. Going back to graphic novels again, one of the books I read is actually something that you own. It's called The Magic Fish, but you haven't read it yet.
I started it. I haven't finished it, though.
But you can agree that the art style is really nice.
Yeah. It's really beautiful.
Yeah, it's basically this young adult graphic novel about this Vietnamese boy who wants to tell his mom that he is gay. And he kind of has trouble relating to her, like telling her these things because they have like a language barrier and obviously a cultural barrier. But something that they have been able to connect with is just reading stories from the library, specifically like fairy tales. And so you see throughout the book the way that he is trying to tackle this difficult conversation in a way that is like being translated over to fairy tale. So you're seeing like the present day stuff going on, and then you're seeing the fairy tale parallels to it. And then you also see the mom's background story when she was growing up in Vietnam. And basically, I talked about this already in like the best books I've read in 2024, but I really thought this was very well done. The color schemes throughout the book are really nice because it will shift colors from like reds to blues, and that's how you can like differentiate between like the different fairy tales that are being told. It's got beautiful art. The story's very tender, and it's just really well done shit. Another book that I read was A Good Happy Girl, and this was a very short literary novel. Okay, so this woman, she's going through a lot of shit right now. Basically, her parents have been in prison for a while. And so she is like, you know what? I am going to compartmentalize this, and instead I'm going to deal with it by hooking up with a lesbian couple.
You know what? There are worse things.
There are truly worse things.
There are worse things than that. If anything, that would be pretty high on my list of things that are okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
Because you know what? She could have hooked up with a man.
She could have hooked up with a man, and she picked 2 women instead.
Basically, throughout the book, as they, become more, like, sexual and intimate with each other, like, both physically and emotionally, I think her interactions with this couple has to force her to really confront the childhood tragedies that she's been repressing. Surprisingly, this had, like, a low average rating, and I was like, can't a depressed bitch just cope with being a third to an older lesbian couple? Another weird literary book that I read was The Witches of Bellinas. And so this is described as like a dreamy California Gothic. And it's about a woman who moves to this mysterious town to save her marriage, because when she and her husband visit this town, he's like, oh my God, this town is so amazing. We should move here. Our life will be so much better here. And she's like, sure. But then they get swept up in a cult. So it's very like midsummer vibes. Because it's in California, it's more like hippie vibes. The cult leader is literally talking about vibes, and it's like, oh, the vibes here are so great. Like he talks like a surfer bro.
Ew.
It was a very short, weird little book. Again, I feel like you gotta be in the mood for like a weird literary story to like, read this stuff. And then another one that I read, this isn't literary, this is actually a young adult fantasy, but I think you would appreciate this. So basically, this is what made me decide to pick up the book. Literally, the first line of the synopsis is describing the main character. Plain, poor, plus size, and autistic. In this, so she lives in this kingdom, but there's like this monster, and like the country has to sacrifice like, a person to appease the monster. But then she's like, all right, listen, I may be plain and poor and fat and autistic, but I can be very inventive with my mind. And so that's how she, proves herself. She can invent a lot of like really cool things. Her best friend is a prince. She invents something that ends up going very poorly, to the point where like it like threatened like another person's like life, like an important person's life. And so they were like, who the fuck invented this shit? And she's like, oh,
whoopsies.
I didn't know that was happening. And so she's like, oh my God, my best friend / prince, because you are like a rich dude. If you say that was like your invention,
nothing's gonna happen
to you because you're a rich
get a
man.
slap on the wrist, maybe.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so he's like, all right, I'm gonna do it for you because, well, he doesn't say it, but he's like, because I love you.
Yeah.
But then, unfortunately, he does end up facing the consequences.
No!
And so he ends up being sacrificed to the monster. And she's like, fuck, this is all my fault.
Oh, she gotta go get him.
Well, in her mind, she thinks that he's dead, right? But she's like, dude, this is so fucked up that like, I gotta kill this monster and just end these shenanigans forever. Because we can't be fucking sacrificing constantly. This gotta end. And so she travels to the depths of hell, but then she finds the guy there, the prince. But it turns out that he is alive. He's just now a monster. So it kind of gets into a monster fucker kind of thing. I mean, it's young adult, so they don't actually do. But he's described as like, more monstrous now, but it's still like him. It was basically about, them working together to try to escape hell. And like, he's a monster now, but it doesn't matter because she still loves him and he loves her. Another book that I read is a nonfiction called Dangerous Fictions. This one's basically about how society has a pearl-clutching reaction when it comes to fiction. We have had so many book bans throughout history, but I also thought the more interesting parts that I wasn't expecting was like contemporary examples of how people have labeled fiction as like immoral or like bad for society. And like, what does that say about, censorship? What is it about fiction that provokes such moral panic to the point where like we gotta censor like certain books or think that certain books shouldn't be published? But the most interesting part to me that I feel like I'm going to talk about in like a separate video was like the section that was talking about the ability of fiction to teach empathy. A lot of times when we think about how fiction teaches you empathy, that's still placing that expectation on like an author of color or like a marginalized author. And so what is that saying? That like we turn to a marginalized group to teach you something to be a better person, but we just turn to like a white or straight author for like just a universal story, like that doesn't really set like a fair precedent. And so I just have so many thoughts about that I want to make a separate video about it. And another thing that I thought was interesting was like how some people think that books are only valuable if they make you more intelligent.
I hate that.
And I have feelings about that too.
I hate that. That's the same as saying that you should only eat food for nutrition.
Yes, that's such a good metaphor for that.
Yeah. Yeah, sure, I want to make sure to get, my fruits, vegetables, fiber, whatever. But also, I'm going to have a slice of cake because I enjoy cake.
I see the sun is shining on you, and I need to pick up my laundry. So,
okay,
I'm gonna cut to wherever the next clip is. All right, now that we got her out of the way, let me speed run through all of the other books I've read for the rest of 2024. Continue off of books that I own just so that you can still see visually what the books look like. I finished the Haunting Adeline duology by reading the second book called Hunting Adeline, which is just like Haunting but without the A. And believe it or not, the sequel is even goofier than the first book. It was so goofy that I dedicated an entire video to all the shenanigans that happened, but top of level highlights for me were the fact that the main character gets trafficked, but the depiction of trafficking is basically her entering in like a Hunger Games style battlefield where she and the other girls just have to run around a forest while men just shoot at them with bows and arrows, and the goal is to like not get shot by the arrow. Sorry, I was just so allergic to the BS that we saw throughout the book, because what kind of world are we living in that these traffickers are just snatching up these women so that they could sell them, but they're gonna waste their time playing games like this is a duck hunt? Like, I don't know. It was just so ridiculous. Another book that I read that was more properly like the Hunger Games was The Empire Wars. This is a young adult debut where basically the main character was born feral in the wilds, but then she's been captured, and thus she is now subject to public humiliation and execution in a very gruesome spectacle that's known as the Great Hunt. And basically, everyone who participates in the Great Hunt, not only are they risking their lives, they are risking their family's lives. Because if you die, then your whole family gets executed on top of that, right in front of everyone. This is all part of this nationalist regime. So you follow three perspectives. One is the main character. The other is the main guy in this book, who is also one of the participants. And the main girl doesn't know how much she should trust him or not. And then the third character is the princess that is against these games, but she has to pretend to be stupid and not know any better because she has like a greater plan in mind. My favorite perspective was actually the princess, because the moment that she first appeared, it was in the main girl's perspective. So she was just like your average princess, but I knew there was more to that bitch. And then once we got to her interiority, it was so interesting to see like all these plans that she had and all these political games that she was playing in her mind. Another book that I read that also had three perspectives was And the Sky Bled. This takes place in an occupied city where there is literally blood raining from the sky. The three perspectives that you read about are a thief, a slumlord, and an heiress, and they both all have intertangled paths with each other. They know of each other, but then they are both hunting for the same thing, which is this treasure, for their own personal agendas. My favorite perspective out of the three was the heiress, so I'm sensing there is a pattern going on. Another book that I read was The Coin. This is a literary novel about a young Palestinian woman who gets caught up in a scheme of reselling Birkin bags. This book contrasts this idea of luxury versus reality, because obviously the luxury part is her pyramid scheme of trying to resell these bags with like another homeless swindler. But then the reality is her grappling with the fact that there has always been war and poverty and famine, especially with the country that she comes from. So you follow her trying to thrive in America, but at the same time, it feels so stifling to live in this country. This is a book that I kind of feel like I ventured too far into literary, because it got to a point where I couldn't really make sense of what was going on. So unfortunately, it was a miss for me, despite the very arresting book cover. So those are pretty much all the books that I have physically. And now I'm going to be talking about all the other books that I didn't have on hand, but I read it as an ebook or I listened to it as an audiobook. I've separated by genre. So let's start with fantasy. For this one, I read a new adult fantasy called A Dark and Drowning Tide, with a cover that literally looks like Timothée Chalamet and Gigi Hadid in a dark academia setting. This is a sapphic fantasy as well. So turns out it's not Timothée Chalamet. It's just your average everyday lesbian. So the character that looks like Timothy is a folklorist who is very angsty. You follow her perspective the entire time when she goes on an expedition with 6 eccentric nobles in search of a fabled spring. Basically, this is a magical spring ring that it promises untold power, and the king wants to use this to secure his reign of the country. And so she has to lead this expedition basically as a way to prove herself. But unfortunately, it doesn't go off to a great start because the main character's mentor actually gets murdered in the quarters on their ship. So that means that she is now leading an expedition with 5 nobles, and one of them is the murderer. And everyone has their own motive. The love interest in this book is her academic rival. And so they have to work together to not only find this magical spring, but also figure out the truth about who murdered the mentor. What kind of threw me off is that the main character gets so angsty about how she is like on the fringes of society. She literally describes herself as like a gremlin. But then you see her on the cover and she literally looks like Timothy. I'm like, girl, you can't describe yourself as monstrous when you literally look like a hot person. But who knows, maybe in their world she is not seen as hot. But really all she needs to do is move to Brooklyn, and I guarantee you that all the gays will snatch her up. Another fantasy book that I read was Slewfoot. This was set in colonial New England, back in the days where if you were a woman and you breathed, all the other Puritans would be like, oh my god, she is a harlot. How dare she show her ankle? This was a time where the only worth that you could have as a woman is if you married a great guy. However, the main character's husband dies under mysterious circumstances, so now she's a widow, and the husband's brother is like the biggest misogynist ever, and he's like, I guess I'll do you a favor and marry you just so that you have something going on in your life, because obviously you can't have anything else if you're a single woman. But then she's like, you know what, I'm not gonna marry anyone. Instead, I actually just want to take care of the farm that my deceased husband and I were taking care of, and I'll just do it myself now. And everyone's like, what the fuck is wrong with you? What makes it more complicated is this presence called Slewfoot, which is a powerful spirit, and basically in another world, this could have easily been a monster fucker book, but it doesn't go that way. I was starting to wonder though, as I kept on reading further, because Slewfoot doesn't really seem to be endangering the main character. Slewfoot is endangering other people, but we don't care about them because they're a bunch of misogynistic, disgusting men. So all these men are accusing the main girl of being a witch because these mysterious circumstances keep on happening. And with the presence of Slewfoot, who is actively contributing to the deaths around the farm, that's not really helping the main girl's case. I was more into this book in the first half than the second half. I think the second half got a little bit too chaotic for me in a way that I knew I should have found it satisfying, but I just didn't. And maybe I just wanted the book to turn out differently than it did. It's still definitely very atmospheric though. So if you're into dark fantasy, this could be more for you. Another one that I read is The Familiar, and this was set during the Spanish Golden Age. It follows an orphan who uses scraps of magic in order to get through her miserable life. She doesn't try to show her magic though, because obviously if you show your cards, then that's how you get used. Unfortunately, her mistress discovers that she's been hiding this talent, and so now the mistress demands that the main girl uses her powers to better the family's social position. This ends up capturing the attention of royalty. So now things escalate even further, and she gets recruited by the King of Spain. She also gets help from an immortal familiar who has his own dark secrets. Even though the writing for this is way better than the Grisha trilogy, I couldn't help but notice that there were familiar plot beats that were going on compared to this author's original trilogy. Because basically both the familiar and the Grishaverse follow an orphan girl who gets exposed for having magic powers, and then she gets whisked away by royalty and has to be used for political gain. And she also has a love interest that is dark and brooding and mysterious, and she doesn't know if she should trust him or not, but she can't help but be drawn to him. So it was interesting to see those familiar plot beats, but within the context of historical Spain. I also read The Islands of Elsewhere, which is a middle grade book written by the same author as Emily Wilde. I was curious about other books that she's written, and before Emily Wilde, she primarily wrote middle grade. It follows 3 siblings who stay at their grandfather's seaside property, and in their backyard, they have 3 islands. The people in this town call these islands the in-between places because they're full of magic. So this book is about the 3 sisters trying to unravel the mystery of these fairy islands and discovering a long-buried secret while they're trying to help their grandfather who's become ill. This was a book that reminds me how middle grade books are just not for me. I think I wanted more stakes to it. I think I wanted more stakes to this story instead of it being too chill all the time. But, you know, that's just me wanting more drama and chaos and mess. And that's not what this story was going for with this cute three sisters trying to go on this seaside adventure. And that's fine. I will still stick to Emily Wilde. Next, I'm going to go more into speculative fiction. One of these is The Ministry of Time. It takes place in the near future where the government has established this program to test out time travel. They want to see if time travel is feasible for your body and for your mind without things getting too fucked up. So they decide to test it out by gathering what they call expats, basically snatching up people from historical times and bringing them to present day and just evaluating what happens if anything goes awry. So the main character is a government worker and she is tasked with working as a bridge. And what that means is she is like the metaphorical bridge between the past and the present. So she lives with and assists and monitors one of the expats that gets snatched up from the past. The person that she monitors is Commander Graham Gore, who originally died in 1845 on an expedition to the Arctic. Now that he's in present day, he has a lot to catch up on with the fact that these slutty little bitches are showing their ankles out in the open. He has to figure out what Spotify is. How do you work a washing machine? What do you mean that the British Empire has collapsed? There's a lot to catch up on. They also end up falling for each other. So I was very interested to seeing how this was going to work out. I ended up really enjoying the dynamic between the lead characters. I found it to be very charming. I do think the first half was more interesting than the second half. What was surprising to me was the discussions about race, because I feel like a lot of times when there are time travel stories, they don't really touch upon that, but obviously there would be tons of cultural differences that are going on when you have to interact with someone who lives during a different time period. Another book that I read was A Magical Girl Retires. This is basically about a millennial woman who is depressed, dealing with credit card debt, lost her job during the pandemic. So as a result of these difficult struggles, especially during this economy, she tries to kill herself, but unfortunately her suicide attempt is thwarted by a magical girl that enters in her life and tells her that she is also a magical girl. And unfortunately, it is not as fun as media portrays it to be. She has to go to job fairs, join trade unions, attend classes. Like, it actually feels like work. I don't think it particularly stands out to me, but I would be down to watch it as like an animated short film, because I do think that it's interesting to see like the contrast of the magical girl aesthetic and how charming and fantastical it is. And then you compare that to the real world and how gloomy that is. And then how do you like balance those two together? I also read another magical realist story called Snapdragon. This is a graphic novel about a young girl who befriends her town's witch and discovers that she also possesses her own strange magic. And this was so adorable. I was very, very charmed by it. The main character and the old woman that she befriends are both such quirky characters, and you just instantly like them. They're very endearing. And I even love seeing like the background story of the witch in the neighborhood, because she's an old lady, but like you can tell straight off the bat that she's a lesbian. And then you see the flashbacks that do indeed confirm she was a hot butch. And I'm like, good for you, bitch. At first, people in the neighborhood think that she's weird because she is a witch who sells roadkill skeletons online. And so the main character starts to get involved in this strange work. And then you meet other side characters and animals that are very adorable. I just thought it was so wonderfully queer and quirky, and I really enjoyed reading this book. Next, I'm going to shift over to fully contemporary books or literary books that I have read. One of them, it ended up being one of the best books I read in 2024, and that was Any Man, who I found out is written by one of the actresses that was on Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants. And that is just so unfair to me, because what do you mean that you are an actress and an amazing writer at the same time? Because her writing ate. This is a debut novel where it follows a bunch of different men who have become victims to sexual violence from a serial female rapist. The story highlights the different experiences that these men go through. You don't see the act act actually happening, you see the aftermaths and the consequences of that and the emotional turmoil that they all go through and the fear of not knowing who this woman was and where she will be because she hasn't been caught. And it was really interesting to see how rape culture affects men and the shame that they carry with it, and how other people in society are not taking these crimes seriously because the victim is a man. The writing was so sharp and raw and visceral. Every character in the book felt so human to me. I also read I'm a Fan, which is about a woman who is having an affair with a man, but she becomes obsessed with the other woman that the man is seeing. So she will literally stalk this other woman's social media and observe how this woman's life is so perfectly curated in such like an arbitrary, privileged way, despite the main character clearly being flawed and having so many grievances and clearly going through the whole world with a chip on her shoulder. Because the writing was so sharp, that's what made it enjoyable. Even though I probably would not be friends with this girlie in real life. Actually, if I were her friend, I would have stepped in and been like, girl, what the fuck are you doing? Cheating with a man. And not only that, cheating with a trash man too. He ain't shit. Like, she's literally talking about how this guy does not give a fuck about her, and yet she keeps on going back to him and she wants his attention and approval and validation. And at the same time, she's like inwardly talking shit about this other girl. And the observations that she makes about the other girl, they are very astute, because it definitely did bring forth a lot of people who exist today that have like picture perfect Instagrams, and they call themselves tastemakers because they know how to put together like a dinner party or know the best kind of sustainable fashion that's out there or whatever. But it really speaks more to their privilege to afford all those things, to be a tastemaker. Like, her observations about that are very accurate. What I found interesting was this line where it says she doesn't understand what racism is. She only posts the exceptional things that Black people do on her feed. So there's commentary about performative allyship that is especially relevant in the US and the UK. But it's so interesting to me how the main character uses social justice as a way to look down on the other woman, to the point where it makes me wonder if she genuinely cares about it, because she's obviously aware of all of these social issues to the point where she can observe it in such sharp writing. But at the same time, you literally don't see her doing anything else other than getting hung up over this stupid man that doesn't give a shit whether she lives or dies, and this other woman that she just stalks on social media. So to me, it makes me feel like the main character only cares about social issues because other people have the privileges that she wants. It's not that she gives a fuck that people of color are oppressed or that white people have an unequal amount of privilege compared to other people. It's the fact that this white bitch is sleeping with a man that she wants to sleep with, and she's using the whiteness part as a way to drag the other woman down. And so I feel like it would be very interesting if the book tapped into that or like called out the main character in some way about it, but we didn't really get that, and we're limited to her perspective only. And this is a perspective that doesn't really get challenged when we could really do so much more. Like, again, I don't mind the main character being flawed, and I think it'd be so interesting to call that out in the book, but unfortunately we don't. I also read Other People's Clothes, which is about two American expats who go to Berlin. The main character is doing this to escape the spotlight of her best friend who had recently been murdered. So she's now studying abroad in Berlin and becomes roommates with another exchange student who is more of like a party girl. They sublease an apartment that's owned by a well-known writer of thriller fiction. However, they start to suspect that their landlady is watching them and using specific details about their lifestyles and everyday routines as inspiration for her next thriller book. So the party girl is like, you know what, if we're gonna be characters, we gotta be the main characters of this novel and give her something worth writing about. So they go through this whole montage of parties and drugs and sex, and you basically follow these messy party girls and their toxic friendship. And later on, there is a little bit of murder. I do wish the murder was like a bigger part of the book rather than something that happens later. Like, this is something that is talked about in the synopsis, that the murder is gonna shake things up. But it doesn't really happen towards like later on. And I feel like it would have been better if it happened earlier and then we had more of the events surrounding the murder. I also read Sugar Baby. This is about a mixed race 21-year-old girl who is living at home, working as a cleaner. She's raising all this money only to spend it all on clubs in the weekend. So she's very lost and kind of going nowhere in life. But one day she meets the daughter of one of her cleaning clients who works as a model and a sugar baby. And so that girl ropes her into the world of being a sugar baby. And so from there, you see her escaping the mundane life and going to the world of the rich with these extravagant tasting menus, champagne, glamorous hotels. I do wish there was more introspection because I feel like a lot of the way that sex work was depicted kind of fell to the same tropes that you would expect for these types of stories. I also felt like the story was meandering a little bit. Like, even if it wasn't going to be anything deep or introspective, it could have at least been more chaotic for the entertainment value. But instead, it was kind of like in the middle for me. Another book that I read was about basically hating men. The main character is an aspiring artist who feels trapped in the nuclear family dynamic. She's an aspiring writer, he's a filmmaker. Surely they are going to live a successful creative life together. However, cut to a few years later when she's dealing with motherhood and being a wife while he gets to pursue his ambitions, she starts to feel very resentful. Then her career flourishes and then their marriage falters and then eventually the guy leaves her. And so this is a book where she's recalling their marriage. I found that it wasn't really giving anything new other than a woman ragging on a man. And this is a lot coming from me, okay? Because according to the average man that accidentally stumbles upon my channel, you would think that I, a misandrist, would be into this book. It reminded me a lot of the TikToks that you see of women who shit talk about their incompetent husbands that gaslight them and they're a narcissist and all of these things. And it's like, yes, we know you resent him. Yes, we live in a misogynistic culture that values men's ambitions over women's. But like, what else? What makes this book different than like your average Tuesday? I could literally open TikTok and see another woman complain about her husband and it would be the same shit. So I think personally as a reader, I just want something more unique than that, you know? Like, if you're not gonna fucking murder him, what are we doing here? And then the last literary fiction that I also felt meh about was State of Paradise. Basically, the main character is a ghostwriter for a famous thriller author, and she and her husband return to their mother's house in a Florida town where she grew up. Her sister lives next door, and that sister is so obsessed with using something called Mind's Eye, which is a virtual reality device provided to citizens of this town, and it's owned by Electra, which is this big tech company in South Florida. Later on, the writer's sister goes missing for several days, and then when she returns, the main character is forced to investigate what happened to her sister and other missing people and how Electra is tied into this. So this was kind of giving Black Mirror vibes from the synopsis, but when I read it, it was just so hard for me to connect with the story. I found it difficult to care about what was going on, which is weird because, you know, if you're going into like a tech dystopian world that's set in Florida, you would think some crazy shit is gonna go down, but unfortunately, just not for me. And now I'm gonna talk about the romance books that I read, starting with A Merry Little Meet Cute. This is a holiday rom-com that I read during the holidays between an adult film star who gets cast as a lead in a family-friendly Christmas movie. And the love interest in this movie is a pop star who was a former bad boy, but now he's trying to like recover his image by going into this family-friendly movie. The thing is, people that are working in production at this family-friendly rom-com do not know of her previous acting credits because she had auditioned using a different name. The only person that knows that she is an adult film star is the main guy himself, because he recognizes her as the woman that he would frequently watch when he was having his alone time. And she recognizes him because he was her childhood crush growing up when he was active in the pop star scene. So they know each other and they clearly have the hots for each other, but because they're on a family-friendly set, like literally like a Hallmark kind of deal, they have to like dampen down their horniness for each other and try to keep it rated G. And so I thought this dynamic was so interesting and fun, and it really makes me want like a steamy Christmas rom-com. I also read My Kind of Trouble, which is about a con woman who enters this small town with her sights set on a wealthy mayor who's going to be her next victim. Basically, she wants revenge on the man who stole her father's music streaming algorithm and ruined his life, so she's ready to take him down. The main guy in this book is a librarian and piano teacher who also has to raise his little sister, and both of them are autistic. His sister is selectively non-speaking, so he does have to put in a little bit more effort to make sure that, you know, she has a normal childhood. He has a lot on his plate. However, when the two of them cross paths, they obviously are attracted to each other. I like the dynamic of the guy being kind of nerdy and very straightforward and no nonsense, and then the girl being very charismatic and charming. And you know what? He still had the moves in their sexy time scenes, so good for both of them. Next, I'm going to be talking about the books that were either short stories or anthologies, starting with Someone Who Will Love You in All Your Damaged Glory. This is actually a reread because I first read this quite a number of years ago, and I decided to reread it in 2024 because my friend was reading it for the first time. This is written by the same creator as BoJack Horseman. So if you like the show, I think a lot of like the humor and stylistic ways of writing the dialogue gets translated very clearly in this writing for the book as well. There's also a lot of like incredulous humor that the author puts into these stories as well. Like for example, there's a short story where there's a young engaged couple that has to deal with their relatives getting nosy and interfering with their wedding, because apparently in this world you have to have a certain number of ritual goat sacrifices for the wedding, and so they argue about what number of goat sacrifices would be appropriate to satisfy their relatives who are attending the wedding. So it's just like weird shit like that that's very funny and tongue-in-cheek. So I do think if you like that kind of humor, you would enjoy this book. And then an anthology that I read was Never Whistle at Night. This is a collection of dark fiction stories written by Indigenous authors. There were some stories that really hit for me, and then there were some where I just didn't really care for it. But that's the problem that I tend to have whenever I read short story collections or anthologies. I will say that the story that stood out the most to me was Quantum by Nick Medina. I actually read this right after I made that video that was talking about the controversy regarding this author that may or may not be Indigenous. Basically, there was a nonprofit organization that wrote a statement about how this author was not Indigenous because when you look at their family tree, you can see that it doesn't match up. And then they started talking about blood quantum, which opened the whole can of worms, because evaluating whether someone is Indigenous enough based on how much Indigenous blood they have is not something that takes into account the violent history that Indigenous people have faced. And so what was interesting about this story was that the parents in this short story had two children, and one of them had just enough blood to make them considered to be Indigenous, whereas the other son didn't have enough blood, and so therefore he is white. And it was really interesting how the parents had to reconcile the two different lives that the kids will face now, because now the white person is going to be able to thrive and be privileged. And like obviously it was exaggerated for the sake of this story, but the implications that the story was talking about was very interesting, like food for thought, especially because of the recent discussions that I had seen online about blood quantum. Okay, now let's talk about the nonfiction books I read, starting with Down the Drain. It's written by Julia Fox. She's basically kind of like someone who you assume to be a Nepo baby, but she's not a Nepo baby. And I mean that as in she's like famous, but you're not really quite sure what for. Like she does some modeling sometimes, she does some acting sometimes, but she's more just known just for being her. In this memoir, she talks about her childhood living between Italy and New York. She's dated boyfriends who are drug dealers. She's been in psychiatric hospitals. She has worked as a dominatrix. She's lived in a couple of trap houses when she was an addict. She has lost a lot of her friends to addiction as well. She made her big break in a movie with Adam Sandler. She dated Kanye West for a minute. She has just been doing all kinds of things and experiencing so many different things in one life. I do think the book could have been edited better because there's so many random characters that just pop up and then they don't get mentioned later on. It was still entertaining for me to read. Another book I read was Of Boys and Men. This book basically talks about the ways that boys and men are struggling in literally so many aspects you can think of, whether it's economically, not making as much money anymore, socially, not really making strong supportive networks, education, they're not doing as well as their girl classmates are. Even in terms of like resilience too, when you evaluate women dealing with hardships versus men dealing with hardships, men are just struggling way more in that aspect. And so the author lists all of the things that men are kind of like falling behind in, and then lists some possible things that we can do to help men. But unfortunately, I guess the misandry is still too strong in my veins because I had a lot of mixed feelings with this one. The thing is, I understand why it's really important for men to be supported, because in order for us to live in a society, we gotta help everyone. But I think what has kind of given me pause is the fact that like we're talking about all the ways that men are falling behind, but we're not talking about how there are areas that men have thrived because of sexism and oppression towards women. I feel like we can't talk about men without talking about misogyny because they are so deeply intertwined together, especially when a lot of the problems that the author talks about, he doesn't really seem to present reasons why we have these problems in the first place. Instead, he's kind of like, who knows where these problems came from? And so I think it's weird to kind of just like pretend like everything's in a funnel without evaluating the bigger picture here. So for example, the author talks about part of why boys are doing worse in education than girls is because there are predominantly more female teachers and boys respect male role models more than female ones. So part of his solution is to have more male role models. So we should have more male teachers, more male authority figures. So that way there's like healthy examples of healthy men, which I understand and I can agree with. But I also think we're not interrogating the root issue about why boys don't have respect for women in the first place, and that's why they're not listening to their female teachers. He also talks about how men have lower resilience to overcoming challenges, and an example for that is how divorced women statistically are able to bounce back in life and be happier overall compared to divorced men who are struggling getting back in there and having like a well-rounded life. But it's weird to like talk about that without also acknowledging that when you look at marriages between men and women, so many times women have dealt with the brunt of physical, emotional, and mental labor, and that has benefited the men. So of course, men would be less resilient when they divorce because if you look at the statistics, single women are happier than married women, and married men are happier than single men. There is a reason for that, and you can see those reasons clearly within the gender dynamics that straight marriages have. What's also interesting to me is the fact that like boys are doing worse in school compared to girls, when you consider the fact that like for a period of time, schools didn't even allow girls in the first place. So literally the education system had been built around men. So why is it now that like we are making more steps towards equality and accepting more girls into whatever fields they're studying in, men are doing worse? You have literally built that system to benefit you, and you're not even keeping up with the system that you have built. That's what is so confounding to me. And I wish that the book dived into like the reasons why there is. And like maybe it's also because women are expected to outperform men in order to even be considered equal in the first place. And so he suggests all these changes that we should make to these programs in order to like better accommodate boys learning this stuff. But I just find it so confounding how like literally we have to do all these things in order to get boys to resonate with the learning material, but meanwhile girls have always have had to adapt to these things. And so I feel like there's this root issue that's happening here that we're not addressing, because unless the rubric is specifically geared towards men, then they're not thriving. And something that I disagreed with that the author said was him saying that the term toxic masculinity should not be a thing because that prescribes masculinity in negative language. I agree that there are healthier examples of masculinity that we should be promoting, but there's a reason why toxic masculinity is a term, right? Like, let's call a spade a spade. Masculinity has been to the detriment of many people, both women and men alike. And who set up those systems in the first place? You get what I'm talking about, right? Well, maybe not most of you. I feel like a lot of men might get angry with me saying this thing. Basically, I feel like just changing things in order to accommodate what men lack, it only puts a band-aid on these problems because we're not questioning why men are like this. And I feel like a huge part about why men are like this is misogyny. But I think anytime you bring that up, people get so defensive over it because they hate feeling like the bad guy. Patriarchy has benefited men, but it's also the reason why men are falling backwards in society. I don't think that's a crazy notion to have. The next book that I read was A Face For Picasso, and this is a book about a woman who was diagnosed with Crouzon syndrome. She has an identical twin sister who has had the same condition. This is a very rare condition where the bones in your head have fused prematurely. So growing up, this author and her sister have endured so many procedures to try to change their appearance. This would involve breaking the bones in their heads and faces to make room for organs to grow. The book talks a lot about the PTSD that comes with so many of these invasive surgeries that she's had since she was so young. But not only that, the mental turmoil that comes with just looking different and having a facial disfigurement compared to your peers. And what I really liked was her using the idea of Picasso's artwork and him as a person as a way to frame her story. Because when a journalist had talked about her and her sister, the journalist compared their faces to Picasso because he has an art style where their facial features are in different places. And she talked about how it was interesting the way that people viewed her and her sister as conventionally ugly, and yet an artist like Picasso is revered for having this type of artwork that show faces in unique contortions. I think she's a really strong writer. I was captivated the entire book, and I would definitely be interested in reading more from her in the future. Another nonfiction book I read was The Message, and this follows the author's journey traveling to Colombia, South Carolina, Senegal, and then also Palestine. I've read his books before, and he is consistently a very strong writer. I also thought it was really interesting how he compared slavery to Zionism based on his experiences observing what was happening in Jerusalem. And I really appreciate the ways that he has unpacked the nationalist myths that have shaped so many different cultures and has tied that to his own experiences as a Black man. So the parallels historically and even present day were very poignant and interesting. And then the last three nonfiction books I'm going to talk about are kind of grouped under the same topic of the experience of being bipolar. And I picked up these books because I met up with a friend who was talking extensively about recently realizing that she is bipolar, and I wanted to learn more about that. So I picked up An Unquiet Mind, which is a memoir about living with bipolar. And then there were two graphic novels by the same artist called Rocksteady and Marbles. Out of those three books, I would say Marbles is my favorite because that one is more of like an introduction to how it felt like to be bipolar, and it talks specifically about how the artist had discovered it herself and how she kind of like grappled with whether she should treat it because she tied so much of her creativity to the mania that she would experience as a bipolar person and the fears that she had about possibly losing her creativity if she were to take medication and try to balance herself out. The ways that she has drawn what it felt like to be bipolar with like the messiness of the drawings and the scribbles and everything helped me kind of like understand visually the feelings that she felt without it necessarily being described through writing. Her other graphic novel called Rocksteady is more of like a self-help guide for people with mood disorders. So she's basically giving tips and tricks for how to deal with mania or a crash out or any of the things that would inevitably happen when you are struggling with a mood disorder. And Unquiet Mind was a very short memoir, and I think because it was of an older time, I would have liked something more contemporary, especially because we know so many of the things that we know now with the advancements that we have made for studying about mental health and psychology. But it is interesting to see what it was like back then, like back in the 90s. And similarly, the author for this book had resisted taking medication as well. And so I think, again, it's interesting to like try to grapple with like how much of you do you have and then how much of the you is going to get taken away with medication. And so that basically summarizes all of the books I read in 2024, and my next video is going to be books that I read in 2025. So I will see you next time in the next book wrap up. Bye!